there was a section of the Wesleyan University Music Department. The reason I was going to go there to do ethnomusicology, it was called the World Music Program. They had that term, and that meant they're covering other countries. They had teachers of, in fact, they had a teacher of koto and shakuhachi from Japan, and they had a Indian drummer and singer, and I forget what all. They had quite a few African something or other. They a gamelan teacher from Java. They had at Wesleyan already by the late 60s. They were covering a lot of parts of the world musically. So we'll take this step by step. Japan was beginning to trickle up into consciousness, and partly because of composers and people like, I just went to a lecture the other day about Debussy, French composer who in the let's see, when was it, 1887 I think it was, in Paris at an international exposition, he heard a gamelan from Java. This gong chime orchestra, gamelan, everybody high. And that greatly affected his compositional style after that, the tone color and things like that. And there's a lot of debate about which came first, his clever ideas or the gamelan influence, but never mind that. Partly because of his interest, and then other composers hearing this, and Benjamin Britten learning about Balinese gamelan, and Benjamin Britten then learning about Japanese music for various reasons. He saw a no play. Britten was in Japan for complicated reasons back in the 1940s, famous British composer, and he watched a so-called no play. Very slow-moving, masked actors, so you can't even see their facial expression, but they have to get this emotion across, sometimes hardly moving. He wrote an opera based on a no play called Curlew River, based on Sumidagawa. And they just performed that a lot a couple of years ago to celebrate the centenary of his birth. And so people like that began to show interest in Japan, but those are composers. The masses in the West weren't that interested yet in Japanese music. We didn't know enough about Japan. And it wasn't as easy to flip over there for a short holiday, and we couldn't look at it on the internet either, YouTube, etc. Japan, okay, now this is way off the question you asked, but nonetheless, never mind. Why does somebody like something or other in the West? I was a folkie. I didn't like opera. My parents were fine on opera. They liked Western classical music. It's okay for me, but no. Give me folk or a bit of rock. I did some rock music. Why do people go one direction or the other? It's not just family context, because both of my parents were serious classical music people. And it's not exactly that they turned me off to it, but they didn't turn me on to it. I don't know why. Maybe my friends, And then, okay, off in Japan, too, if you're raised in the countryside, depending on partly social class and stuff, the rich landlord's daughter has to learn this koto because that makes you elegant and you'll find a rich husband that way. They expect you to, it's like you have to learn the piano now as replace the koto. If you want to have a rich husband in Japan and you're a woman, play the piano. Okay. But you got all these village events that need folk songs. You're out in the field working manually, doing this work. You need to coordinate activity. You do not sing an aria from some Mozart opera. You got songs that talk about your daily life there and about the insects that are around you and the pregnant woman over there. You make these things up on the spot sometime. It relates to daily life. But by the time I got to Japan in '69, Japan had gone from 80% rural 100 years later to 80% urban already. See Hughes, 2008, for all the details built out of my thesis. But anyway, a lot of these musics are quite contextual. You need to have a reason. It can be family heritage, just the local environment, or you've got a friend who says, hey, come along with me, like the reason I went to the Balkan dance stuff. Hey, I'm taking lessons in the koto. Come along, you'll like it. It's a social thing, and you go along and maybe you don't really like it, but you like all the people, so you hang around there and then you get to like the koto. That happened in Japan to a lot of people. All of these paths can be different, And it took me a while to find that there was decent, what I call decent, whatever that means, that there was what I would call folk music, folk song in Japan. And of course, it's not musically anything like Western folk song, but nonetheless, I could relate to it as a folkie. I wanted to have that picture of that kind of culture. About the time I got there was an interesting one because within a few months we had a folk song boom in Japan. triggered by partly a young gal who had been a guest at my folk song teacher's annual contest. She and I were the only two guests performers, and within 2 months she was now on national TV, their equivalent of the BBC, on a new program which BBC, the NHK over there, had created to make folk song appeal to the masses again, meaning urban as well. Urbanization was really rolling along. If you came to the big city to get a job, like my folk song teacher in Osaka did, he'd come maybe in, let's see, when would it have been? Maybe around 1960. He came from the far north of Japan, from a little village, first to Tokyo and then down to Osaka, the two biggest cities in Japan, to just do some building work because he needed money. He needed a job. Well, a lot of his other countryside friends, they'd get together in the pubs in the evening and complain about how everyone made fun of them because they were country bumpkins with funny accents, and they were not respected. They were just working class scum, you know. So they get together, drink, and what would they do to be happy? They'd sing songs from their villages. And often the people from the same part of Japan would get together in some pub, hang around with their homies, and sing those little songs. Well, my teacher, for example, Tanaka, they all would say, "Tanaka, you're so good at this. Could you teach me how to do this, you know?" And he became a teacher for reasons like that. And eventually good enough that some rich country merchant type guy helped him buy a bar where he could teach. We call these folk song bars Minyo Sakaba. Okay, he stumbled into that as an urban migrant, desperate for a sense of home. But then for a certain populace in the big cities, particularly the ones who come from the countryside, this music still resonates for them. And now they're going to pay money to relate to it again. Your typical middle class and upper middle class urban person doesn't want to have anything to do with that. And there are always exceptions. You know, I'm not working class country bumpkin. Why do I do American folk song? That's a long story too. It has to do with the whole rise of folk song in England, America, etc. You know, it reached the masses, the upper class as well. There's a lot of people like Steeleye Span. You didn't have to be a farmer to like folk music, you know. But it's a long process. Anyway, so let's see where we're at here. So in Japan, with urbanization, folk song struggled to reach a wide audience, but their BBC, i.e. NHK, wanted to make a program that would try to get this traditional culture back into life. But to do that, they figured, well, we can't just have these country folk coming in their sloppy outfits and doing work songs. It was by then this music had also become a stage art anyway. Some people would do it on stage, or in a work song that you would never have an instrument accompanying because you're busy with your hands. Now you would use shamisen, shakuhachi, taiko, these traditional instruments, to accompany it. You'd make an arrangement, just as Benjamin Britten, Vaughan Williams, and other British composers, and various American composers would do with traditional folk songs on their islands. So English folk songs have now been arranged. You want to hear somebody playing a piano, you want to hear the great old tenor Peter Pears singing some folk song in a totally non-folk way, you can do that. Japan had an intermediate path there where the people singing them were using a folky voice in the big cities. They were on a stage wearing fancy outfits they'd never wear in the fields, but it was kimono. They weren't wearing Western clothes. And they would sing in a folky voice, but a little more polished, more fancy ornamentation also of traditional type. And they would have instruments, but traditional instruments. Well, so NHK decided, let's make this program called Minyo o Anatani, folk song to you. We're going to make it reach you. And the two people who starred in it were a mix, a guy and a gal, both young, 34-year-old guy and a 20-year-old gal, the one who was a guest at my teacher's event. And they would perform some of their pieces wearing traditional garb, fancy kimono, and the other half, he would wear this leisure suit, which is what back in '77, what you had on if you were a cool young guy, and she would wear blue jeans. And she triggered what they called the Jipan Miyo boom, the blue jeans folk song boom. Suddenly young people were looking at this. When I was interviewing kids a year, well, even at that time, out in the countryside at schools and stuff about, what do you think about folk song? And I had lists of possible words like furukusai. That's old-fashioned, it's boring, it's exciting, it's cool, it's, I don't get it, you know. And most of them thought it was old-fashioned, they didn't get it. What is this, wearing these kimono and stuff? What are they doing? You know, what is this? I don't understand what they're singing about. Well, her purpose in life with her blue jeans was to trigger, oh, you mean I can I don't have to wear this stupid kimono to sing folk song. You know, it's hard to put on kimono. And your typical young kid doesn't want to do that anyway. I certainly don't. And suddenly this boom was triggered for a few years, and a lot of young people were suddenly doing it. And my teacher suddenly had a bunch of young people, and all the folk song contests that were being set up nationally would have a children's division with a lot of kids in it. And this kind of faded a little. It's, well, not a little, it's kind of gone now. If you go to the same kind of contest now as I would go to 35 years ago, let's say, the children's section is really small. There aren't many under the age of 15, so they've often had to extend the children's age up to about 20 to get enough to make it sensible. The old folks, it's an aging population anyway, but it's the old folks who really like this music. So instead of, let's say, 20% kids under 15 in the contest doing the children's section with its prize, and then you've got the adults from 15 to 40, and then the elders from 40 to 55, and then the real elders from 55 to 70. Now they have anyone over 70, and then they've got 55 to 70. You have to have two separate old folks bits that are just full of old folks. And then you have to lump all your adults together, and there's very few kids. So folk song somehow, partly with the whole accessibility to all the world's pop musics now through the internet, it's just too many other optional musics that you could grab onto to like, and folk song just has been going downhill a lot. Now there's more fusion groups too, though. If you're going to do it now, you're more likely to have a rock band going along with it or something. And a lot of my young friends are doing this too. They're playing traditional type folk song, and they're also playing with rock bands. That's over in Japan. So yeah, somehow folk song is still there. There are also, but they had to create things called preservation societies to try and keep some of these songs alive. And this is another factor. Often they're preserving one song from some area, like West Tokyo, there's this one barley threshing song. Up until the I can't remember the date when they gave up, but maybe the 1940s. Up until then, so many of the work songs in Japan were being done while you did work by hand. Catching fish, pulling nets, maybe the 1920s or 30s in some cases, rowing a boat until the 1910s, and then you got a motor, you don't do it anymore. Threshing barley, the machines do that now. So people who actually had done any of these work songs while doing the work, there's hardly anyone alive who has ever done this. When I was doing research 35, 40 years ago, yes, I could talk to people who had actually done this stuff. Now they don't. But often what happens is one of their kids, age 40, will say, "Granddad," or "Father," or whatever, "that song you were singing in the bath while drinking sake, what was that?" "Oh, that's the old barley threshing song we used to sing." "Oh, really?" And there's this 1970s, as Japan became an economic power again and important in the world, and more local pride was booming up. Suddenly they thought, well, maybe our traditional culture isn't as bad as we thought it was. Maybe this music is worth paying some attention to. Maybe we have to pass on to the next generation some knowledge of our farming past in this village and all that build us into the wonderful people we are. So they tried to revive these folk songs and keep them alive. The thing is, a lot of these preservation societies, of which, there could have been a couple hundred, there are hundreds, just say hundreds, each with maybe one song they were really focusing on in their local village. So many of them have collapsed now because, the members are too old to do anything. When I went back about 5 years ago, and I was going to go up to this two different places I visited 30 years earlier. One was this barley threshing one, and they were still keeping it going. They still had their Preservation Society, and I went back last year and visited them yet again. It's still there, they're still doing it, but the guys who perform this whenever they can and have a national contest for this song, they're all like in their 70s, and they can't convince any young people to follow on. And they used to try and do it in schools as well and get the kids interested, but that didn't seem to work. The kids weren't interested enough in their grandma and granddad's era. And another place I was going to visit on the other side of Japan, I phoned up the local cultural office to try and make contact with them because I couldn't figure out how to reach them otherwise. And the two teachers in their 80s who had taught me back in 1980 to sing this song and paid me to come down and learn it in their village and sing for their locals, now those two, of course, had passed on, and the man in charge of the Preservation Society was about 75, and he was in hospital, very ill, and he said, please don't even come to see what's going on, because it's collapsed, nothing's happened. The song is dead, you know. So that's one of the paths I've been following in my research, you know, is where are these songs going? And they're all well documented. There's tons of recordings, there's videos, there's notation. Scholars have done this, and the local cultural officers are still trying to keep these songs alive. I put one cultural officer in Nara together with some people from the mountains down south who I visited 38 years ago and watched them dance. And their village is just kind of depopulated. There's like 30 people living there, and they're all ancient. And he said, you know, you can't let that dance die that you used to do. They'd stopped 3 years ago doing their ancestral dance. Not enough people would come home to do it. And the singer that was the main singer of that song, when I asked him about 10 years ago, what happens, you know, he was 68 years old, what happens if you're too ill to sing or something? He says, chushi, that means the end. They won't do it. And 3 years ago he gave up. He was too old to sing. And that's it. So, I'm not sure if there's a path to that, but basically this folk song world, I've really enjoyed being part of it. I caught it at a good time, at a kind of a revival time, and I watched it go downhill, and I can still meet up with people I met 40 years ago, 38 years ago, 39 years ago, and talk about these old days. And I can still twist some arms with some of the young people. But the youngies are interested in the really lively stuff, like the powerful 3-string tsugaru shamisen. It's like rock guitar. They like this. Just getting up and singing a song to them, you know, doesn't quite work well enough.
The sound.
Yeah. And I mean, American... See, we've had a revival in England, which is kind of interesting. They've called it various things, but it's for a while it was called New Folk a few years ago, N-U-F-O-L-K. Suddenly all these young people plucking guitars and then adding in other instruments and writing new folk songs, kind of the way Bob Dylan was doing as well. They're in old folky style, sort of, but they might have a keyboard and stuff thrown in and nice harmonies that wouldn't have been there in the old days. And they're singing about their tough life these days in their small town someplace. We call that folk song here still. Why not? But it's in Japan, they have two different words, minyo and fokusong. Fokusong, when they first adopted that word, from English of course, was when Peter, Paul and Mary and Bob Dylan, etc. were becoming popular. And it was all these guitar plucking Japanese who hated traditional minyo, which means folk song in Japanese. That means literally folk song. Strangely, that term was translated from the Western German word Volkslied, which is when we first decided we had something called folk song in the 1850s. 1880s, Japan said, oh, well, gosh, we're getting Western here in Japan in the 1880s. They have folk song. Do we have folk song? And for the first time, they began to try and have a category that they called folk song. They had all the music, they were singing it, they just didn't have a name for it. And now they had a category called folk song. They still do. But then that turned out to be different from a Western folk song. And those worlds are still kind of different. In this country, they've always been together, kind of, because traditional folk song, you throw in a guitar, it's still folk song, you know. It's still in English. We don't have Japanese influence telling us we're going to do our folk songs in a different way. But the Japanese suddenly have Western influence, world powerful Bob Dylan and stuff like that, you know. So one path or the other, I'm afraid in Japan, if it's anything, they're, even though you don't hear the word folk song that much anymore, the Western music world is dominating most young people in Japan these days, despite the best efforts of the government and the education system now to include traditional music in schools, etc. We don't teach a lot of traditional music in schools in England, but there are plenty of Morris dancers around. There are plenty of guitar plucking folkies and stuff, you know, and just different environments, I guess. Yeah.